Afghanistan? No. Ukraine? Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. Yugoslavia? Abstain.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The United Nations resolution to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state caused outbursts of joy among the Jews of Palestine. For 2,000 years, declared Golda Meir, we longed for redemption. We anticipated this great day with awe, and now it has come, so great and wonderful that it is beyond expression.
The Jews rejoiced, celebrated, danced, and sang. I saw them with my own eyes on the beach, opposite the Moghrabi cinema and near the Cafe Pilz. I saw how happy they were. I returned to Jaffa, and people were walking about and saying, the Jews are rejoicing. The English have betrayed us.
The entire Arab world reacted furiously to the possibility that a Jewish state would arise in Palestine. A mass demonstration was held in Baghdad, and riots broke out in other Arab cities. The storm even reached as far as Aden, at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. For 3 days, there were murderous riots in which 82 Jews were killed. Hundreds of homes and shops were destroyed and looted. 4 synagogues went up in flames. In Palestine, the Arabs launched a round of hostilities, aiming to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state by force. A mob converged on the commercial center in Jerusalem, attacking Jewish passers-by. Before the very eyes of the British police, they looted shops and set them on fire. The riots forced thousands of Jews to abandon their homes for safer neighborhoods.
Early in January 1948, there were consultations between Haganah commanders and the experts on Arab affairs concerning the question of whether or not the events taking place could be described as riots. I remember saying during those consultations that I propose a compromise between those who say there are riots and those who say there are not. I believe there is a war on.
With the outbreak of war, 30,000 well-to-do Arabs left their homes for neighboring Arab countries. This was the first wave in a process which would give rise to the Palestine refugee problem. The major burden of war fell on the peasants, the untrained and unorganized fellahin. Their leader was Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini, son of Musa Kazim, founder of the Palestinian Arab National Movement.
He was a dangerous enemy of the first order. He exploited our weaknesses to the maximum, realizing that transportation arteries were, from a strategic point of view, our main problem. His forces were disorganized, but he was there in the field. He was everywhere. He was the most dangerous enemy of the War of Independence.
The Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road was Abd al-Qadir's main target. This route, which in those days was a narrow, winding strip, was the sole lifeline of Jewish Jerusalem. The Jews could get through only in convoys, while the Arabs, who were hiding in the thick forest above, were attacking them. Both sides knew that here was the major test of battle. Whoever loses here loses the war.
When we reached Shar Hagai, I became so frightened that sweat streamed from my head down to my neck. Real sweat. When you knew that they could shoot at you from both sides, you'd hear a kind of echo inside, plucking at your nerves. It was also a horrible sight to see the vehicle in front of you suddenly hit a mine and blow up. But you couldn't do a thing, only bite your lips. You knew who was out there, but you could only bite your lips. You could cry, but you had to go on. The convoy must get through.
During the initial stages of battle, the Arabs met with success. They attacked the Jews throughout the country, cut off communications and besieged settlements. But it was Jewish Jerusalem which suffered the most. Every convoy that managed to reach the city had its toll of dead and wounded. Funerals of ambush victims were held daily.
The most dreadful task that I remember in the War of Independence was to protect the convoys. This was carried out under impossible conditions, as it was illegal, undertaken under all kinds of camouflage, with a minimum of weapons, following a route where anyone could lie in ambush and shoot at you. I remember the convoys almost like a nightmare to this very day. In this operation, we lost our best people, our finest men.
The winter of 1948 was harsher than usual. People were afraid to go outside. Whoever did go out took a can with him, hoping to find a queue to buy kerosene. The semi-siege situation began to leave its mark. The lack of fuel and food became more and more acute. Jerusalem was divided. At the Jaffa Gate, the Arabs set up a roadblock, cutting off the Jewish quarter of the old city. The British Army agreed to bring supplies to the besieged inside, making their way around the wall. The British made certain to bring in only food. They did not hand over the supplies until they made sure that they contained no smuggled weapons or ammunition. There were roadblocks throughout the city, and every passerby was searched. Despite this, the Arabs did succeed in penetrating Jewish neighborhoods. On February the 1st, a booby-trapped car destroyed the building of the Palestine Post, an English-language Jewish newspaper. 3 weeks later, Jewish Jerusalem was shaken once again by an explosion on Ben Yehuda Street in the center of the city. More than 50 bodies were pulled out of the rubble. This disaster, perpetrated by pro-Arab British deserters, intensified the crisis in Jewish-British relations. The recurring question was, where exactly does Britain stand? Government House continued to manage the affairs of the country. However, the High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, complained that during the final months of his term of office, he was compelled to maintain control without a clear policy from London. Sir Alan therefore continued to go about his daily routine. In January 1948, he participated in a ceremonial bestowal of honors. This strange event took place while only a short distance away. The Arabs and Jews were killing each other, and as His Majesty's forces were observing the events from a standpoint of neutrality. The Jews complained that neutrality usually worked against them. Until the very last day of the British mandate, the Royal Air Force did not cease pursuing the dilapidated ships laden with Jewish refugees sailing towards the shores of Palestine. But while hunting down illegal immigrants in order to deport them to internment camps in Cyprus, they tolerated the infiltration of Arab volunteers and mercenaries across Palestine's borders. The Arabs no longer bothered to conceal their forces in the hills. They even invited reporters and photographers to observe their maneuvers. Britain uttered mild protests over the presence of a foreign army in the country, yet took no action to remove it from the area, as she did not wish to spoil her relations with the Arab states. On January the 10th, an Anglo-Iraqi pact was signed by British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. Bevin visualized Britain playing a major role in the Middle East. Hence the official announcements that Britain had decided to leave Palestine met with considerable skepticism.
The people in the Foreign Office, I don't suppose there was unanimous advice, there never is, but those people who gave that advice, I'm sure, were influenced by their judgment that the Arabs would win the subsequent war, with a very complex feeling. But part of it was, well, hell, we can't prevent these fellows fighting one another. I mean, we'd only get a lot of British soldiers killed in between Arabs and Jews and things, and very likely it will be settled by the Arabs winning. But even if it isn't, we can't stay there. It was largely an act of impotence.
The impression that the Arabs had the upper hand was strengthened on March the 1st, when they succeeded in planting a booby-trapped car at the Jewish Agency building. This was the best guarded spot in all Jewish Jerusalem. In this disaster, 13 persons were killed and 70 wounded. George Marshall is disappointed with Jewish military strength, said reports arriving from Washington. The United States Secretary of State George Marshall now maintained that American support of the partition plan was a mistake. President Truman had great confidence in Marshall, who had been Chief of Staff during the Second World War. At the same time, pro-Arab circles in the U.S. administration, headed by James Forrestal, renewed their pressure on President Truman to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state.
I remember one time talking to James Forrestal, who was Secretary of Defense. And he said, Clark, you just don't understand this. It's a question of arithmetic. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there are 45 million Arabs and 350,000 Jews. And the 45 million Arabs are going to push the 350,000 Jews right into the ocean. So he said, that's all there is to it. Well, I didn't think it was so, and President Truman didn't think it was so.
But Truman kept his thoughts to himself. He let the State Department examine an alternative to the partition plan, which would transfer Palestine to a United Nations trusteeship after the expiration of the British mandate.
I gave orders that nobody was to come to see me and talk about the Palestine affair. Dr. Chaim Weizmann had been trying to get in all along, and I wouldn't let him in.
But Dr. Weizmann, the Zionist leader, indeed saw President Truman.
It was known that Eddie Jacobson, who had a haberdashery shop together with Truman in the very early days, who had gone through the war with Truman, was still in the habit of meeting Truman in spite of Truman's rise to eminence.
This man with whom I was in business was one of the finest men I ever had anything to do with. And he and I completely understood each other, and we offset each other. He was one of the best buyers that ever I came across, and I was one of the best salesmen that he ever had to be associated with.
There were some of our friends in Boston who had some connection with Jacobson through B'nai B'rith and other Jewish organizations. Jacobson was by no means a very vehement organized Zionist, but he had a sense of history, and therefore when he went into the White House, he knew that he was going to have the most important meeting of his life.
He came in, he stood around, didn't say very much, was as quiet as he could be, and I finally said, Eddie, what in the world's the matter with you? Have you at last come to get something? Well, because you never have asked me for anything since I've been in the White House and since we've been friends.
Apparently he went to see the president and said to him, you remember your great hero, the Missouri president, Andrew Jackson? Well, this Dr. Weizmann is just like Andrew Jackson. I'd like to tell you that I don't know of any two people in history who are more different than Chaim Weizmann or Andrew Jackson, but nevertheless Jacobson managed to get home, and he received Truman's very typical answer, all right, you bald-headed son of a bitch, bring the old doctor in.
And then he told me that he thought that I ought not to keep Dr. Weizmann out of the White House. He thought I ought to see him. And I told him that I would see the doctor, but he'd have to bring him into the side door. I didn't want any propaganda started on the thing.
The day after this White House meeting, UN Security Council sessions resumed in New York. Abba Hillel Silver, head of the Jewish Agency delegation, was relaxed. He knew President Truman had promised Weizmann continued American support for the partition plan and Jewish independence. But suddenly the American ambassador hurled a political bombshell into the hall.
We believe that a temporary trusteeship for Palestine should be established under the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations. In our opinion, the Security Council should recommend the establishment of such a trusteeship to the General Assembly and to the mandatory power.
The speech that Ambassador Austin made at the UN came as a great surprise to President Truman. I recall the circumstances. He called me very early at home. Maybe it was 6 a.m. The morning after Austin delivered the speech. And he said, have you seen the morning paper? And I said, no, I was still in bed. And he said, get down right away because something's gone very wrong. So I was there maybe within a half hour. And the story told in the paper told about Austin having delivered a speech at the UN the day before in which he stated that the United States supported a trusteeship for the Jewish state rather than partition. That was exactly contrary to the president's position. And he said he did not know how this could happen. And he said, I don't know what Chaim Weizmann will think of me, because he said, I saw him just day before yesterday and told him that we would continue to support partition, and he said he must think that I'm an awful liar.
The proposal of the United States government to suspend all efforts to implement the partition plan approved by the United Nations General Assembly last November under the leadership of the United States and to establish a temporary trusteeship for Palestine is a shocking reversal of its position. After the last few days, the spokesman of the United States delegation told the Security Council that the American government firmly stands by partition. Both the President of the United States and the Secretary of State have repeatedly, within recent weeks, maintained that the position of the United States on partition remained unaltered. We are at an utter loss to understand the reason for this amazing reversal.
On March the 20th, 1948, the day after the shock at the Security Council, the Jews suffered another blow. Abdelkader's fighters, thousands of fellahin, attacked the convoy with fury, shouting battle cries. For the first time, a convoy failed to break through to Jerusalem.
I suddenly entered an unbelievable barrage of fire. It was like hell. The convoy was in flames. From every side, men and women were jumping out of blazing vehicles. Drivers jumped from their burning trucks and were killed in the ditches. The armored vehicles returned fire. I ran through this hell, and suddenly, right in front of me, a vehicle went over a mine and was blown into the air.
19 vehicles were trapped at the side of the road. Some of them can still be seen there today, memorials to those days of awe and glory. When the chairman of the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion, heard the news, he understood at once. Jerusalem was now under siege. Ben-Gurion concluded that the concept of passive defense was bankrupt. He now ordered an offensive, aimed primarily at breaking the siege of Jerusalem.
It was clear that Jerusalem would not be able to hold out without supplies. We would not be able to send convoys unless we kept to their commanding positions no matter what, in spite of the British. It sounds crazy, but many things arise that seem crazy at first when there is no other choice.
The battle for Jerusalem became the symbol of the 1948 war. It is difficult to imagine how poorly armed the Jews were in those days. In the eyes of the British, these weapons were of course illegal, so they had to be stored in underground hideouts. Not only Britain, but even the United States and all other Western countries imposed an embargo on arms to the Middle East. The Jews desperately attempted to obtain arms from any possible source.
By the French police. It's said to have been addressed to Tel Aviv. The contents speak for themselves. With the possibility of full-scale war between Jews and Arabs in the near future, weapons of all sorts are obviously at a premium.
Salvation came in March 1948 from an unexpected source. Czechoslovakia, acting on Moscow's orders, supplied an arms shipment of unprecedented size, which enabled the Jews to launch their first offensive, aimed at breaking Abdelkader's siege of Jerusalem. Castle, one of the Arab villages dominating the Jerusalem road, passed from hand to hand several times during that week. On one occasion, something happened that changed the fate of the campaign.
We saw three figures moving towards headquarters. When they advanced, we assumed they were Haganah's scouts. Meir shouted at them, "Get on with it," out of impatience. We were at a distance of some 15 meters, and within a thousandth of a second, we all realized that there was some sort of a mistake. One of them had barely time to shout, "Hello, boys," when we realized it was a mistake. Then Meir pulled the trigger. The middle one fell at a distance of 15 meters from the door. The other two jumped off the terrace and managed to escape. He was wounded. He was lying alongside headquarters and asked for water. Then he was through.
The dead man had a Lebanese driver's license in the name of Abdelkader al-Husseini. So was the end of the most dangerous enemy of the Jews, but their victory was short-lived. The Arabs counterattacked and succeeded in recapturing Castle, where they found the body of their admired commander and brought it to Jerusalem. Abdelkader's funeral at the Temple Mount was a stormy event. Tens of thousands followed his coffin, weeping and firing in the air. Many Arabs felt that they lost an irreplaceable commander, and that from now on everything was shattered. During Abdelkader's funeral, the Jews once again took over Castle without firing a single shot. To their great surprise, they found themselves in an abandoned village. They could not understand what had happened to the Arab guards.
I think the people who were left to guard it had come back in order to attend the funeral of the late Abdelkader al-Husseini. And I remember that I told them, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, Abdelkader, we have to attend his funeral." And I said, "What is happening to Castle?" And they said, "No, it'll be all right. We left a few people there." So whether this is the cause or it isn't the cause, I don't know, but I know for a fact that people who had been left there, or some of them, did come back in order to attend the funeral.
Following this victory in the Judean hills, the first Jewish convoy proceeded to Jerusalem, laden with ammunition, provisions, and reinforcements. Only now did the drivers from the coastal plain realize what they had done. They had saved Jerusalem. The most widely publicized of all military actions during the spring of 1948 was the capture of the small Arab village of Deir Yassin. This operation was undertaken by the Irgun and the Stern Group, two dissident underground organizations which did not accept the authority of the official Jewish leadership. 250 Arabs lost their lives in the conquest of this village. Newspapers in Palestine and elsewhere reported the indiscriminate massacre of men, women, and children. The official leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine harshly condemned the dissident organizations which had conquered Deir Yassin. However, the Irgun and Stern Group rejected all charges against them and insisted that all Arab casualties fell in the heat of battle. The Deir Yassin action intensified the flight of the Arabs. Many fled their villages before a single shot was fired, fearing another Deir Yassin. The poor, small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem thus came to symbolize the flight of Palestinian Arabs and the Palestine refugee problem.
There were most stringent orders from political leaders to the regiments and units to make all efforts to behave as a most humane conquering army. The results would be that the Arabs would not flee. There were also objective circumstances which had to be taken into consideration. Arab propaganda exploited the incident at Deir Yassin, exploited all the horrifying things which took place there. But we know what happens in battles all over the world. In Korea, in the world wars, regular armies have harmed civilians in a far more serious manner. The manner in which the Arabs exploited Deir Yassin, I would say, was the greatest boomerang of that time.
On April 16th, the United States called for a special session of the UN General Assembly.
The United States would heartily support.
The Americans indeed sought to replace the partition of Palestine with a UN trusteeship, meaning simply to prevent Jewish independence.
Can be found to support them.
It is somewhat ironic to note that the Soviet delegation headed by Andrei Gromyko came to the UN with instructions from Stalin to support the Jewish state.
Позиция Соединенных Штатов, как она изложена в только что представленных нам предложениях, она является логическим продолжением той позиции, которую Соединенные Штаты проводили с самого начала консультаций между постоянными членами Совета Безопасности.
In behind-the-scenes diplomatic consultations, the representative of the Jewish agency, Abba Hillel Silva, could often be seen coordinating positions with Mr. Gromyko.
During the period in which the Soviet Union supported the idea of a Jewish state, they supported it in their usual way. They're either 100% for you or 100% against you. And during that period, they were 100% for us. And therefore, when the Americans abandoned their support of Jewish statehood, the Soviet Union was the great rock, the great base upon which we built our recovery. And I remember I used to go and see the Soviet representative, Andrei Gromyko, at Park Avenue, usually very late at night. Late at night because midnight in New York is something like 9 or 10 o'clock, so that he could get instructions from Moscow. And we used to sit and conspire against the United States. How could we frustrate the attempt of the United States to win support for the trusteeship proposal, which was going to set the partition proposal aside? There was an Israeli-Soviet cooperation against the United States, if such a thing can be imagined today.
The British administration will leave Jerusalem within a fortnight, and very shortly afterwards, the last of the British troops will be out of Jerusalem.
Whatever the outcome of the UN decision, the British had made up their minds to leave Palestine. They dismantled military bases and installations, leaving them to be seized by the Jews or the Arabs, mainly the Arabs. Several units bid farewell to the population with parades. This was another strange, surrealistic scene, as war raged all about and people were being killed. Britain was departing, leaving behind a vacuum. Palestine was the only British-administered area in which government was not transferred in an orderly fashion to the local inhabitants. The Jews, for their part, followed the British departure attentively and skeptically, preparing to declare their independence as soon as the High Commissioner would leave Palestine and the mandate expired. the Jews experienced both success and failure in their war with the Arabs. The situation in Jerusalem deteriorated after the Arabs besieged the city once again. The population received small rations of water taken from ancient rain cisterns. Great danger loomed over all Jewish Jerusalem, especially the old city's Jewish quarter. The kibbutzim of the Etzion bloc, south of Jerusalem, fought with their last remaining strength against an Arab onslaught. In contrast, the Jewish forces succeeded in taking Haifa, following a 31-hour battle for the control of the city. The Jews scored another victory in Jaffa, Tel Aviv's Arab neighbor, which had turned Jewish life into a long and fearful nightmare. For the first time in many months, people of Tel Aviv felt relieved of their frontline situation. But just as it emerged that Jews had gained the upper hand in their battle against the Arabs of Palestine, a sudden development virtually nullified all their achievements. All Arab states brought their armies to the borders of Palestine. $50 million Arabs declared a holy war against 600,000 Jews. Syria sent half its army to battle. In the Golan Heights, the Syrian command planned the conquest of Galilee. At the same time, an Iraqi column advanced towards Palestine through Transjordan. On May the 11th, King Farouk of Egypt ordered his army to move eastward. The Egyptian Minister of War told his king, "This will not be a war with the Jews. It will be a parade. Within 2 weeks, we will be in Tel Aviv." From his home in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion followed developments with grave concern. He feared the Egyptian, Syrian, and Iraqi armies, but his main worry was the concentration of Arab Legion troops in Transjordan. This was the best regular army in the entire Middle East. Arab saber-rattling intensified U.S. pressure on the Jews to agree to indefinite postponement of a declaration of independence, pressure which was often accompanied by threats.
The threats were not made outright, but rather by emissaries, by reliable journalists, who would come and say, "I want you to know that I heard from a reliable source in the State Department that if you do not accept their proposal to delay declaring independence, it is liable to block fundraising efforts for Palestine." When we asked the State Department if this was true, they denied it emphatically, fearing criticism by American Jews and our friends.
Did you know American officials were putting pressure on Jewish organizations to postpone declaring independence for the Jewish state?
Oh, I think during the period when we were working for trusteeship, we urged them to do what they could to help us get more time to find a solution. If you want to call that pressure, it's all right.
In early May, you met with the Jewish leaders and tried to persuade them to postpone their declaration of independence. Do you remember what your arguments were at that time?
I don't even remember the meeting. I think our arguments were general at that time.
Well, can I show you a statement?
This says, in early May 1948, Assistant Secretary of State Dean Rusk entreated the Zionists at least to postpone their declaration of independence. I think I probably did. That was our policy at that time. If they did not, this is from Mr. Sakar, History of Israel. If they did not, the threat was implicit that Washington might block the transfer of American Jewish philanthropic funds to the Jewish state. Well, I think Mr. Sakar or somebody else put this implicit threat in there. Because if there's one thing that an Assistant Secretary of State cannot do, it's to affect the transfer of funds for philanthropic purposes anywhere. And I just categorically deny that I ever said
You
any such
deny
thing.
that?
Sure. Nonsense.
American Jews converged on Washington. Partition, not trusteeship, was the demonstrators' slogan. They ascended Capitol Hill, seeking to pressure their representatives to exert their influence and rescind the decree. They surrounded the White House, but in vain. From now on, American policy would seek to halt the process of establishing the State of Israel. On May the 12th, the 9 members of the Jewish National Executive were summoned to a meeting at the Jewish National Fund building in Tel Aviv. Ben-Gurion was to ask them to decide whether there would be an independent Jewish state in another 2 days.
We thought that we were taking a great risk. No one said, never mind, not even Ben-Gurion. There is no doubt that Ben-Gurion was the strongest and the bravest. But I also saw Ben-Gurion in late 47. The country was aflame. He called me and said, Golda, I'm going mad. I'm not sleeping nights. I now know what the Haganah has at its disposal and what it is lacking. We are to face a war. What is to become of us?
In the assembly hall, behind closed guarded doors, Yigael Yadin, Haganah Chief Operations Officer, presented a survey of the situation. Yadin, wrote Golda Meir, said that we had a 50-50 chance, an equal chance of winning or suffering defeat. His assessment, according to Golda Meir, was horrifying.
When she said horrifying, that was her own personal reaction to my evaluation of the situation. But I don't think that Ben-Gurion thought so. Rather, he considered it quite encouraging, because several national executive members, who had no idea of what was going on, felt we had no chance whatever, or at best our chances were very slim. So I believe that some found my assessment rather encouraging.
Ben-Gurion now applied all his weight to convince his colleagues. We can face it and win, declared the man who 2 days later would be the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel. On May the 14th, at 8 in the morning, the High Commissioner, Sir Alan Cunningham, reviewed a guard of honor at Government House in Jerusalem. Several hours later, at the port of Haifa, Sir Alan watched the lowering of the flag for the last time. Only a few people observed this ceremony, which marked the end of Britain's 30 years in the Holy Land. On that same Friday afternoon, 5th of Iyar, 5708, May the 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion arrived at the Tel Aviv Museum building. His entire life had been directed towards this very moment. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. Accordingly, we members of the National Executive, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Israel. And by virtue of our natural and historic right, and the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, here declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. The State of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will be based on freedom, justice and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education and culture.
First of all, I wept. Since then, I don't believe that I have shed tears. I had associations from my childhood in America. We learned at school about the Declaration of Independence. Over there, every child knows the preamble by heart and knows of the great men who signed it. And here am I, signing the Declaration of Independence.
This is the original historic recording of Hatikva, the Jewish national anthem, played by the Philharmonic Orchestra at the conclusion of the independence ceremony. Now, for the first time, the words "to be a free nation in our own land" became a reality. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally round the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel.